Hello, this is a video response to Confused Matthew's review of Back to the Future Part 2. Um, Confused Matthew, looking at what you said, some points I do agree with, some points I disagree with. The only reason I say I disagree with some points because Back to the Future Part 2 was the first one I saw, and it was rented. I wasn't old enough to go to the theater and see it when it was released. I was only 4. But you did make some very fine points about it. Now, since it being the first one, I didn't see the first one till later. And when I was watching it, for the most part, I was greatly confused by what was going on. As everybody knows, time travel is a very tricky thing in science fiction, and Back to the Future is probably the only film that to some degree got it as close as they could possibly get to it. But for the most part, time travel is a very tricky thing to do in film. And Back to the Future Part 2 is a very great example of that. The whole back and forth. There's a lot of things that were left on. There's a lot of loose ends that weren't tied up into it. A lot of continuity things that were going on. They bump into people and they see them and they act confused and things like that. There were numerous times in the film where they could have ruptured the space-time continuum plenty of times. In many instances in the film, just tweaking little events slightly and little by little. For the most part, Back to the Future 1 and 3, they're pretty much bookends. I honestly believe they intended to make Back to the Future Part 3, but they wanted to make Part 2 just to somehow bridge the gap between the two films. Like most movies, it's very hard to make a sequel that's as strong and as great as the original, which I think is something that Back to the Future Part 2 suffered from. Even today, in most movie sequels, you can see it, like Pirates of the Caribbean 2, The Matrix Reloaded. What else? There's another sequel that wasn't that good. Bad Boys 2. It's really hard to make a sequel that pretty much lives up to the original in terms of originality and, being a pioneering type film. There are some exceptions to the rule. Just look at Die Hard 2, or even look at Lethal Weapon 2, which I think Lethal Weapon 2 is better than the first one in my opinion. But yeah, that's pretty much it. I do agree about, the ridiculousness of Biff becoming a supervillain in the second one. It really doesn't make any sense. The only thing I can say about it is that, to some degree, it is a very reasonable conclusion to come to, since this is an alternate timeline Biff, and essentially, a person's personality will change, I guess, in an alternate timeline. But, I'm no philosopher on time travel, and I'm not even going to go there. It's a pretty insane thing to try to rationalize. And for the most part, all 3 movies are great. Part 2 is the only thing I have against Part 2, and that it's very confusing and strange. And for the most part, I thought they had the plot wrapped up in the first 10 minutes or so, with him keeping his kids from going to jail, and then they just threw Jennifer in there, and then they gotta rescue her, and then they gotta stop Biff, and all this other stuff. It's insane. Well, that's all I got to say about that. See ya.